Evening, friends. My name is Ramesh Shivanna. Welcome all of you for the web talk on industrial civilization by Dr. D.K. Hari and Dr. D.K. Hemahari, organized by Industry and Trade Forum, partnership with Pride Energy Environmental Resource and Research Institute and Tony Foundation and Rotary Green Park. Now I request Satish Sen, co-founder Industry and Trade Forum and Director of FKCC for welcome address. Over to Satish.
So let me welcome Mr. D.K. Hari and D.K. Hema Harish. Sir, welcome to the today forum, sir. So today we'll have an excellent session, and I like all of yours will be enlightened with the tradition and the knowledge which has been gained by Mr. Hari, and they do all this by doing research. There is nothing which is scripted. It will be research, and I think all our friends will be enlightened today. I also welcome my guru, Mr. Prasad Prabhudev Aradhya, and my co-founder, Madam Uparaniji. I welcome all the participants today. So over to Mr. Ramesh, sir.
Welcome again, and today the subject is industrial civilization. Many of our industry friends said it is an unusual subject for all of us. A civilization is generally defined as an advanced state of human society containing highly developed forms of government, culture, industry, and common social norms. Industrial society is a society driven by the use of technology, enable mass production, supporting a large population with a high capacity for division of labor, overall living standard, as well as the inequality, a more scientific attitude to problem solving and environmental degradation. Mahatma Gandhi quoted once, "The people of Europe today live in a better built houses than they did 100 years ago." This is considered an emblem of civilization, and this also matter to promote bodily happiness. Formerly, men worked in the open air only as much as they liked it. Today, the work environment has changed for better quality. A wishful desire, a very human being for which one keeps striving throughout his life, is dignity. This is most essential for the growth, development, and stability of individual personality. Our generation keeps speaking of 18th century industrial civilization. The industrial civilization began with a change in production system due to primarily the invention of steam engine, power looms, spinning machines, and improved transport systems in the 18th century. Today, we are going to listen how industrial civilization involved an interlocking series of social, economic, and political institutions and ways of life which become increasing prominent. The embrace technology and organizational change, as well as the application of science and reason to social affairs. So with this, I request Mr. Prabhudev Aradhya, Director FKCC, to introduce today the speaker of the day on industrial civilization. Over to Mr. Prabhudev Aradhya.
Thank you, Ramesh. My friends, good evening to all of you. It was more than a decade back when I was invited to be part of a private audience with Gurudev Sri Ravi Shankar for a presentation on Rama Setu. It was a simply fabulous presentation there, very factual, with a lot of validation and proofs. Under the guidance of Gurudev Sri Ravi Shankar, Bharat Gyan is an endeavor to bridge old and the new world by repurposing the knowledge from the past for the present and for the future also. Not only to experience it, but to appreciate and apply is what we are the founders of Bharat Gyan. That is a brilliant couple, Dr. Hari and Dr. Hema Hari. Dr. Hari did his schooling in his Rishi Valley School, Madanapalli, graduated in commerce from Madras Christian College, completed his post-graduation in business administration from PSG College of Technology, Coimbatore. He has over 20 years of industry experience in marketing, brand building, supply chain through his family-owned business in petroleum and FMCG vertical, as well as from the building material industry. Dr. Hema Hari, born in Mysore, is an IT professional turned writer, traveler, researcher in civilization studies, and a conceptualizer cum founder of Bharat Gyan along with her husband, Dr. D.K. Hari. She graduated in physics and later did her post-graduation in computer technology as a topper from Bombay University. She is a PMI certified project management professional with over 20 years of experience with IT industry, with first 10 years in TCS, the next 10 years at PSC India. Focused mainly on managing innovation and nurturing new technologies for worldwide. She brings in good understanding of technology with innovation and creative solutioning. The family is engaged in community service in the field of healthcare, education, and culture. The Hari couple have traveled extensively to over 30 countries and visited museums, expositions, other attractions worldwide, understood those civilizations, their culture, and knowledge. It was this exposure that motivated these professionals, husband and wife duo of the management and IT, to leave their lucrative professional careers, to turn into research collaborators, to conceptualize and to found Bharat Gyan as an endeavor to fill the void in showcasing the knowledge, practices, and culture of the Indian civilization. Their compilation currently runs around close to 500 hours worth of multimedia content, with factual content on 108 different subjects, including today, on the state of knowledge in India, its traditions, its sustainable practices compiled with dedication over the years. The Hari couple have evolved into subject matter experts on the overall understanding of India across the ages for over 8,000 years to the present. The knowledge of the Indian civilization, which is vast, deep, and is availed but scattered in various forms, in books, manuscripts, oral traditions among scholars, various art forms, customs, and traditions of the land. The facts and data collated or corroborated each other beautifully forms a jigsaw puzzle, and thus keeps us self-validating this growing compilation spanned over 108 subjects. With this knowledge, one question crops up to me. Can we make the past converge with the present for the future? We can hope that this knowledge and approach of the ancients will kindle and aid future research for the benefit of the science and mankind. Apart from many, they have published a monumental series called The Autobiography of India, comprising of many multi-volume titles, of which 2 titles spanning across 9 volumes have already been released. Amongst them is also another relevant subject to highlight for today. They have brought in a book, Brand Bharat. It's a 5-volume title about how India was perceived by the world as a brand for many things in the past and how it can position itself as a brand in future too. The second one, Made in India, is a book on products made and traded from India to make India as a brand. Friends, most of these details would be available to you on the bharatgyan.com. Do visit that and you will be really informed much more. I welcome all our good friends here and the illustrious couple researching so hard to bring in the great positives of the Indian civilization relevant for today's modern day and life. It's over to you, Dr. Hari, Dr. Hema Hari.
Namaskar to all. Thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this session with all of you good friends. And I'd like to thank Sri Prabhudeva Aradhya for specifically, he called us about, of course, we have been friends for over 10 years, family friends for 10 years. And so nice of you to say that. And specifically, he also organized a session in the Bangalore Club almost about 7-8 years back. Yeah, that's right. So wonderful. And of course, we know his daughter quite well. And so from that perspective, when he called us about a month back, we said, certainly we'll do it. Be happy to do it. And here we are. Okay. And I'm glad it's an association of industry. And we at an all India level in Delhi, we've been associated with FICCI on a variety of projects over the years, especially in the Pravas Bharati Divas, which has been organized by one of the people organized at PBD is FICCI. So we've been associated with FICCI in multiple ways in the industry at a national level and international level. Okay, getting on the subject of, let's look at, because when we say India is an industrialized land and has been so for millennia, centuries, that raises a lot of questions in people's mind. Is it really so? So that's a fundamental point. So let's look at that point and some short films and some slides. Okay, let's get on to that aspect. Okay, India. So we look at this for a few minutes. India has been an enigma, not only for India itself, but for the world as well. So we look at some aspects of this enigma that is India. See, we have had different images of India over the ages. The most popular image of India the world over is obviously the Taj Mahal. And with a lot of Maharaja in this land, that's how people look at this land. With a range of snake charmers, that's a perspective they get. And people go around in elephants. This is a common perspective for the last couple of centuries we have had, with cows on the road. And obviously, unfortunately, they also showcase a lot of poverty. But beyond all this, there's a certain resurgence that's India now. That is specifically now it's been happening. And this all come about, kick-started with this particular thing. Now let's see how this happened, this image of India. When you look at it about 700 years back, when Europe was coming out of dark ages then, because Europe was under dark ages for almost 1,000 years, from 350 CE to 1350 CE. At the time, Marco Polo, a traveler from Venice, he came to Asia, then he came to Southeast Asia, then he came to the Malabar coast of India, and then he went back to his land. So when he went back to his land, he wrote about his travels. So the travels of Marco Polo became a big document of Europe to understand the world, and especially Asia, the parts he traveled. So this became one of the, and in this he very clearly speaks about the fabulous wealth and splendor that dominated the European minds then. And this was what dominated European minds, because they thought such a land could not exist. And in his description, he writes, there are millions of precious gems in India, millions of gold coins. Then he speaks about millions of fertile country in this land, and millions of amazing people. And the word millions, of course, is the English word. In the Italian language, it's called milli. So he was dubbed as Marco Milli, because people could not dare believe that a land could be so prosperous as what he's describing, and that could be so industrious as what he's describing. So he was actually described as Marco Milli, because they couldn't believe it. And when this happened, he was actually, that was a very derisive term they gave to him. But when you go on further and look at it, this is written by others also, apart from him, much later. They speak about how when the Greeks with Alexander came to the Indus River region, they found there were about 1,500 cities in that region. That is about what, 2,300 years ago. They speak, I don't know whether there are 1,500 cities in that region. Probably cities could have meant even big towns. So that was, and with high degree of prosperity. So you're talking about a region with prosperity and that sort of perspective. This was the actual perspective that was given. And all this is possible. And what happened to all this is what we need to see.
See, the story for India's evolution, devolution, whatever we can call it, starts with Istanbul, and it was earlier called Constantinople. Now, around 1300s, what had happened? See, until then, this Constantinople was part of the Roman Empire, the Christendom of Roman Kingdom, and extension as the Byzantine Empire after Byzantine Emperor. And it was called Constantine because of one of the emperors there. Then the Turks, who were on this side, or in Asia predominantly, this region which is called Asia Minor, this used to be the place from where trade from India used to get into Europe. So like Marco Polo had come, they would go all the way by sea, and then it would go take a land route and go this way, or it would go this way. Now, what happened is when the Turks came, they wanted to throttle this trade. They wanted to throttle things going into the European world. So they took over Istanbul, Constantinople, called it Istanbul, and they stopped the trade route. So then on, all of Europe, which was starved for Indian goods. So this is when you really see, you know, when we read about Christopher Columbus having sailed and found America, we hear about Vasco da Gama, but nobody ever tells us why they did it. The reason is they all wanted to find a sea route to India. Because Istanbul had blocked the sea route, they all wanted all those goods that were coming from India. That means there was so much of trade happening from India, and they were so much dependent on this trade from India. That is what this is really highlighting, which unfortunately is never ever mentioned by the Western world. They never speak about this dependency, but that is what we do have records that we can show you later, going back to 100 BCE. You know, the first century BCE, we have records from the Romans which speak about the kind of goods that were coming into Rome and the amount of gold and pearls that were coming from Europe into India. So that is when the sea route and the search starts for India. There was a Portuguese, Diogo Chao, but he couldn't find. Then there was a person called Bartolomé. We are going a little bit fast in this bit because we want to later on dwell over more deeper thoughts with a group like yours. If you're going too fast, please tell us, we can slow down, okay? I hope you're all right.
All right, it's all right.
Okay. So then it comes to this Bartolomé Diaz, who takes a ship from Europe, and he comes down. But when he reaches Cape of Good Hope, I mean, when he reaches the southern tip of Africa, his ship sinks and he's unable to cross. See, they used to find it difficult to cross this tip and go over to this side. So that is when the first ship that could cross this point, this tip started getting the name Cape of Good Hope. So because if you cross this point, then there is a high chance that you can make it.
But Good Hope, that's why it's called Cape of Good Hope. I'm sure some of you have been to South Africa and been to Cape of Good Hope. That's why it's called, because that was the entry point to the seas to India. So that's how it. So it's all India centric. Okay, next point.
So again, Pero da Covilhã, but he re-established the trade route. No, I mean land route, more not so much the sea route. Then Christopher Columbus in 1492, he started from Spain, taking the biggest ship. He was sponsored by the Kingdom of Spain. He takes the biggest ship. By then they knew Earth was round, so he sailed westwards to come to India. And the first land that he hits, he calls it, I mean, he thinks that he has reached India, and he calls the people there Red Indians.
No, West Indies.
West Indies, and the people there are, he calls them Red Indians. Now, the fundamental point here, till he died, he believed he had reached only India. And the reason for this is, during his time, for Europe, the point to the west where they knew there was land was Canary Islands. So which is just a little bit, above Africa and to the west of Europe. Beyond that, they did not know of the existence of any land. So, and on the eastern side, they knew there was India. So after Canary Islands, if they are coming across any land, they felt that that must be India, which is why actually Christopher Columbus calls this
West Indies. So he calls it. Then we have here Vasco da Gama, who says in his logbook that he takes the largest ship of his time and comes towards South Africa looking for a way to India. And he travels over the stormy seas. And when he says he comes up to the South Africa and turns east, that's when he crosses the Cape of Good Hope. When he turns east, he says he's coming the largest ship of his time from Europe. He sees Indian ships that were the 10 times the size of his ship. And in the midst of them, navigated by an Indian navigator by name Kanha, he turns east and comes up to Kozhikode, which we now call Calicut. So that's how, so that means here we're speaking about Indian ships that were 10 times the size of the ships of Europe of that times.
So 2 points to note. One is the size of Indian ships. The second thing is we normally write Vasco da Gama found the sea route to India. So that one statement worded like that has a lot of implications, which means that Indians did not know sea route And it was Vasco da Gama who set the entire route. But what they don't say is he found it for the Europeans, because Indian ships were already plying in these seas and they were much larger.
Much larger.
So now the question will come, why were they so large? I mean, normally when we talk about trade from India, we normally only associate it with spices. So for spices, why do we need such huge ships? And mind you, they were really very big.
And so if you look at it, it was like looking for a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
So that's how you see, you have India, you have East Indies, West Indies, Red Indians, Indonesia, so many places and people named after Indians. So the world was India-centric. This is around the 13th century, 1200s, late 13 to 15th centuries. They were totally India-centric and they were searching for...
The way today we're talking about America-centric, Europe-centric, the world was India-centric then. So look at the perspective why. They came to India looking for what? Yes, spices was one of them. A variety of treasures, including industrialization and knowledge. So the wisdom. So in all this, collectively, they came to particular land, India.
And we will see how big the ships were really. See, the very word navigate, if you look at it, has the same root as Navgat in Sanskrit, Nava in Tamil. And we have had such old ports which go back to 5,000 years old. And the ship sizes in comparison, if you look at it, they were really 10 times.
See, this is a measure of industrialization. Because when you say you have large ships, why? And how large were the ships is a question mark.
So you have Santa Maria, which is Columbus' ship. So this was about 25 meters. Then you have Vasco da Gama, São Gabriel that we just saw. This comes to close to 30. Then from Indian texts, if you really look at it, you have ships called like Gamini. This is more than 40. Then you have the Tari. These are Indian named ships. Then you have the Jangala. Then you have Plavini. Look at the sizes increasing little by little. Then you have a ship called Dharini. Look at it. It is, even by its name and its imagery, it is supposed to be a bearer of cargo. Close to about more than 80. And Begini, the final one again. So Vasco da Gama was not wrong in saying that Indian ships were much larger. And by names also we find that they were carrying a lot of weight, capable of carrying a lot of weight.
So look at the world share for India, because we had so much shipping and all this, the world share of Indian trade was about 25% as recently as 250, 270 years ago. And look at it dropping year on year and coming down to less than 1%. I'm sorry. So we're talking about world share in world trade. What India's share was, how it was about 1/4 of the world trade and slowly dropped step by step and coming down to less than 1% of the world trade. Now it's slowly increasing. Look at this, how it's happened. So in about 1780s, I mean, when in about 1980s, when this was informed to Europe that it was not Europe and America that is the leader of the world trade, but actually it was India and China, the Europeans could not believe it. Actually, this person, Paul Kennedy, wrote a book about it, and more importantly, it was another person named Paul Byrock who wrote about this, and Europeans could not believe that there could be another land apart from Europe and apart from America that could be world leaders in trade, in industrialization. So they engaged a person by the name Angus Madison, who is an economic historian. We got historians, all of you know very well, but this is an economic historian by the name Angus Madison to study this. He was a xenophile. That means like how Indophile people who study about India, he was actually a xenophile. So he was asked to study about India and China and he did what is called the Millennial Report. He did this and he came up with a proper report.
So based on his projections, a study and the data collected, he lists the countries that were trading in 1 CE and the share of GDP share,
This is
world
2000
trade.
years back.
So 2000 years ago, it was India, which had about 33%. China was about 26.2%. They were contributing to the GDP. There was no America as such, and North America is clubbed with Australia, which is 0.5, and UK is nowhere in the picture. Then in 1000 as well, again, you don't find UK, United Kingdom at all. You find some amount of Western Europe overall was 8.7, and India, China again in the lead. 1500, you find China a little bit more than India. United Kingdom just starts appearing with a 1.1% share. 1600, China overtakes, India falls back. That is when India is, more under Mughal rule, and United Kingdom is still around that 1.8. 1700, India comes back again. And this is a period, if you can correlate, this is the time when India was under the Maratha Confederacy.
Yeah, right from Lahore, Peshawar to in the west, to Bengal in the east, to almost to Shenkota, Kanyakumari in the south. It was under the Maratha Confederacy rule. So that time we are able to again climb back.
But by then, East India Company had come to Indian shores and trade had started. So they are climbing. They have come to 2.9 here.
3%.
1820, India has dropped a lot. United Kingdom has picked up a lot of the trade. 1870, British India starts emerging, and United Kingdom is very close.
See, look at the British India put together, again come back to 20% plus. So it's actually India.
1913, British India goes lower, United Kingdom takes over.
15% put together.
So these are periods actually which tell a lot of telling story about the trade and the trade practices of India, the industrial practices of India before the British, the indigenous practices, and the story of how these indigenous practices were broken and changed over, and a period where the Western modernized process of industrialization also comes into India.
Look at this, after independence.
After independence, Britain has lost India, so it falls immediately. India had been trampled, so it was lying low, and because of certain policies after independence, we still haven't risen much. We are still lying at 4.2. 1973, still India has gone further below.
And UK has dropped also, see. So it's also linked because of India.
And it's become more US centric.
US centric.
US and Russia next. 1998, India has slowly started climbing up. We are nearing the 2000 year 2000. We've started the climb. And then it has continued. So if you look at, because Angus Madison's data stops around that period anyway, but if you look at the graph, if you plot it as per position and the years, and if you show the contrast between India and Britain, you can really see the graph changing. India, which was at the top, Britain nowhere, slowly rising up, not slowly, drastically rising up, and soon after losing India, falling down again. But India falls and then continues to rise, which has been really India's pattern of being resilient. We talk about 3 waves of plunder in India. One is from the near west, and after that...
starting from Muhammad of Ghori Ghazni, all the way up to Nadir Shah. That was a plunder from the near west. Then after that, when the colonial rule came, it was a plunder from the far west. And it continued till 1950. Then what happened? We had a third wave of plunder, unfortunately, in India. That is from 1950, after independence, till recently, we had a third wave of plunder for the last 65 years. After independence, that is we plundering ourselves and putting the money in offshore havens. So that is what we call the third wave of plunder. Actually, we've written a book on it called U-Turn India, which we launched it in the National College grounds in Bengaluru some 7-8 years back. it was Anna Hazare and others who came to launch it then, and so that was a book we launched. And so we looked at it. Our book is there online. You can see it's all available there.
So if you look at this period, this is what is actually called as the industrialization period of Europe. And fundamentally, the entire industrialization of Europe has grown with the industrial devolution of Europe. So industry of India, sorry.
So the industrialization of Europe matches with the industrial devolution of India, because the capital needed for this was taken from India. For the industrialization of Europe, you need capital. You can have ideas, you can have so many things, but what you need is important thing is capital. All of you know in the field of industry, Indian economy provided that impetus, that capital to Europe. Let's look at that now in another slide. Indian knowledge captured. Look at the different eras that the world has had. From 1850 onwards, you got the industrialization era with big machinery, different sort of eras you had. Industrialization era. This was followed by an era called transportation era. Large transportation. Big ships, big trains, big lorries, big planes. This was a transportation era. This was followed by a computer era, where we all started using more and more of computers. That was followed by a communication era. Okay, fiber net cables and all this. So satellite communication, all these eras. Then we're coming on to a knowledge era, where knowledge is going to take importance. Data, knowledge, these are different eras. Then you're going to come to something called, so different eras, so they showcase significance. Then probably in 2040, 2050, you'll come to an era called the mind era. So after artificial intelligence, you're going to go to some era called mind era. So all that we have discussed in one of our books called Brand Bharat, which Shri Prabhupada Aradhya mentioned, so it's there. Now, we'll take one quote
and we will
from
also,
our book, and just put that steel, iron.
yeah, but
Industry era.
yeah, but the contribution of India in all those eras are there.
Iron coating. And then come to that. In the page.
We didn't spoke about the big five. Just a moment, we're getting that. It's a fairly significant, eye opener, that quote. It was just here. This industrialization. Yeah. Yeah, you just showed us the big file number. It's along with that. See, before we go to that, just one moment here. Let me share this bit of the screen as well. Are you seeing the text?
Yeah, no, right now we are seeing the era, that 1850, 1950.
Yeah, good. So if you see all through those eras, there has been contributions from India. During Renaissance, India has given them the thought on what to work on. The sciences have gone from here. There is a whole lot of proof. Actually, we are cramming a whole lot of things into this very small session.
So 1 hour. So we are just showing you sort of nuggets, so you can go to the actual book and read all the data there. We're showing you highlights.
This entire whole school of thought has gone during Renaissance, and which is actually what prompts Marco Polo to come and look for India. And then you know, in another way to look at it is the world was in a travel mode. So the goal for travel itself was to discover India, as we have seen. Then in trade, the various exotic goods that India has traded in. For navigations, India has provided ships. Very interestingly, India did not only have big ships, it made ships for others. It had a lot of shipwrights to steer these ships. And a lot of astronomy, which is needed for navigation, went from India. A whole lot of things. In fact, when Alexander comes and he returns, his ships were built by Indians. So shipping is something that India has, and finally, even the teak for all those ships have gone from India. Because in those days, it was wooden ships that were being built. During industrialization, which we saw just now, the money for starting these industries went from India because of the plunder. Then when the investment era, in a way, set in, India has become the market to buy those goods as well. So if you did have such a big market, you know, a lot of these companies which are trying to establish their, you know, units in the East and India. And then computational era, investment leads to computations. In this era, again, the brains have come from India. From computation, when you have large amounts of data to be transmitted and world goes into communication era, the labor to produce and the market to penetrate again lies in India. Information era, again, we are playing a major role because of the amount of people who are using all these equipment, gadgets, and the amount of data. We all know now, I mean, fundamentally, social media, India is leading. And knowledge era, again, and mind era, all of these eras, if you see, India has had a very major role to play, and everything has hinged on industrialization. And this industrialization, if you will, if you see, actually hinges again around iron, which has been the leading product from India.
I'm going to show you one particular quote.
Yeah, 268.
From the book, page 268. It's a very telling quote. Then we'll go to something else then. Look at this quotation.
Nobody would ever have seen the world from this perspective.
Okay, can you see this page now?
No, sir, we are seeing the same page, era.
Yeah. No, down.
This is a different page.
No,
Can you see this?
No, we are not seeing that. I think you have to stop that page and you have to take out this page. Yeah.
There now? Not yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, 1 minute. Yeah.
Can you see now?
Yeah, we are seeing, yes. Yes, we can see.
This is a quote by a person by name Thomas Carlyle. He's a Scottish philosopher, historian, mathematician, teacher of the Victorian era of England. Look at what he makes a speech in Manchester where he makes a very clear statement. A nation which gains control over iron, soon acquires control of gold. It's a very strong statement observation he makes, because India was a manufacturer of iron and steel for the world for 2000 years and more. So all the gold was flowing into India.
Those big ships that were navigating were actually carrying a whole lot of iron from India to the rest of the world. In a way, if you see much of the wars in Europe, which were fought between the Christendom and the Islamic world with the Arabs. So, you know, you had all the crusades, the dark ages, and the swords of the Arabs.
For both sides, for both the armies, India supplied the steel swords. So the famous Damascus sword and all were supplied by India. So we were the arms supplier of the world for nearly 2000 years. So you can imagine the range of industrialization that was there in India. So the country which controlled the iron controlled the gold. After it moved from India, what happened? The country that controlled the iron went to England and Europe. So the wealth went to Europe. for the period of the colonization. So the shift of manufacture went from India to Europe. Then what happened? From the start of the 1900s, the shift of manufacture of iron and steel went from Europe to Americas. So all the gold moved towards the Americas. United States of America, the manufacture of steel, huge mega steel plants happened there. Then what happened? See, after World War II, Japan started manufacturing steel in a big way, importing raw material, raw ore from India. We have mentioned that in our book, Indo-Japan, how India agreed to supply, continuous supply of ore, iron ore to Japan. So the Japanese steel industry really flourished. So Japan steel became famous because India supplied, India was the only country that agreed to supply iron ore to Japan. So all the shifting happened towards Japan. 1980s onwards, who became the steel manufacturer of the world? China. So all the gold shifted to China. Look at how the pattern moves across few centuries. This one statement tells you a story of how industrialization has moved, how the gold has also moved, how the economy has moved. So this is an important barometer for us. Now let's look at something called Big Five. Okay, let's look at, is the screen shared now?
Yes.
You can see this hand?
Yes.
Yeah, this is a Big Five that India manufactured for the world for not just a century or two, but for a couple of millennia. One is iron and steel. The whole world steel supply was from India. Other is zinc. Third is cotton. See, cotton, there's a very interesting story about cotton. You think, oh, cotton is all over the world. No. If you look at cotton, there's a person who lived in Greece about
600 BC.
Look at this person.
BC.
His name is Herodotus. He was a Greek historian. He wrote a book called Historia. It is only after his book Historia you got the word history now. And see what he writes here. In India, there are plants that produce sheep's wool. So that means that cotton is only from, if India separate cotton, you get cotton to the world. So industrialization, cotton was produced and manufactured and yarn was made in India at that scale. Now let us look at the statement of this particular statement of a Roman senator. His name is Cicero. Okay, he writes, he mentions in the Senate, the Parliament of Rome in 1st century BC, which is what she said about half an hour back. She says, where he says, Cicero says that the Roman Empire has to send 20 million gold coins every year to India to buy the fine cotton and bedeck the Roman ladies in Indian clothes. 20 million gold coins. Look at the value of money that was coming to India then, just for its cotton, for the industrialization era that India was in. And do you know what he says? Okay, you pay so much money, you get so much cotton. Do you know what it is? The cotton is so thin and fine that one layer is not enough to cover the modesty of the ladies, because it's so thin, so fine, so see-through. You need 4 or 5 layers of cloth even to cover the lady's modesty. That's what he says. So that is what it comes down to. And this is what we did as far as cotton is concerned. Look here. And in India, every commoner wore cotton, whereas in Europe, only the rich people could wear cotton, good cloth. So that's what it came through. Look at this. He says this so thin, this muslin was so thin, you could see the inner layers of women. So you need to have heavy layers of cotton. It was continued for a couple of almost 2000 years, both in quality, in weaving, in printing, and dyeing. All these 4 aspects. It was Indian cloth, which is why they started imitating Indian cloth, imposed fine on India. They even banned Indian cloth. To extend the way we had a Swadeshi movement in 1900s, they had a Swadeshi movement in 1580. They said, let's not buy any more Indian cloth because we can't afford it. So that was the strength that India exhibited then to the world. And they even banned it. William Frederick banned, because they were paying the best pearls of Europe to buy Indian cloth. That was it. So similarly, let's look at steel, iron and steel. See, Marco Polo, he speaks about something called on the knee, which is Indian steel. And we have something called wood steel. And the woods is an English word. It actually comes from the Kannada, Telugu, Tamil word uk, meaning to smelt. Because in the English tongue, an Englishman could not use the word uk or uruk, he called it woods. So what do you call wood steel, the best steel of the world? is coming from a Telugu, Kannada, Tamil word of ukku. That's what it came. And when Salahuddin made the famous Damascus sword, he used it only from the Indian steel. And when a Persian slashes somebody, for example, that we have all heard the story of Chhatrapati Shivaji and others, Tanaji and others, Angre and others. When they hit somebody, what do they say? Har Har Mahadev, and they kill. Whereas the Persians and Arabs, when they fought, you know what they say? Jawabe Hind, meaning I answer you with an Indian sword. That was the cry. Jawabe Hind, I answer you with Indian sword. So that was the amount of use of Indian steel that was there all over the world. And because the steel was so watery, the design, the pattern on the steel was so watery, and that was called Damas.
We all know today, when you go to Dubai, the first thing everybody goes is to the Damas shop, because the jewelry is so wavy and curved, beautiful designs. They call them the Damas. Damas means watery. So in Damascus, very interestingly, is the port where all this steel, Indian wood steel with the wavy designs would land. And Damascus, incidentally, is also on the sea coast. So everything is converging in this word Damascus for that place.
And actually, when Alexander was defeated by Porus and then he asked for a gift from India. He didn't ask for gold or silver from India. What he wanted was 100 talents of Indian steel. Talents is like our tola. I'm sure some of the senior people, probably Sri Prabhupada Aradia, will know about the word tola that we used earlier, some 50, 70 years back. Like that. So that's a measure. Like that. So it's a Greek measure. It's called talent. So that's what they wanted, the steel. So it was Indian steel that was going all over the world, exported in ingots, in thousands of ingots, till they could make it in only 1774 in Europe.
Yeah. So actually, if you look at all these records, we will see the moment you think about so many millions of gold coins are coming in for trade from India, and there is so much of iron and steel that's going out, or cotton that is going out. Today's mind will tend to think of huge factories that are producing it. But actually, if you see, this was with a very large, the footprints were very small, but very widely spread.
Widespread footprints, not intense footprints.
So while the quantities were almost equivalent in number, fairly large-sized volume of trade, the units were very small, but higher in number. And that was the distinguishing model of Indian industry. We are just, shortening the entire thing because...
It's all there in the book and the presentation of the film. You can see it later.
But the fundamental idea for industrialization in India and the industrial practice of India lies in this small footprint, widespread, extensive model of industry. And we normally like to use the term, we have a very nice simile to show the impact of that. Everybody in Karnataka, especially, where is it? Okay, again, I'll have to stop the share and.
Yeah, you can go back to the, which page it is.
Yeah.
We'll just stop the share and come into another show. Another very interesting thing. She's spoken about a very nice thing about industry. We'll show you that. Okay, I'm going to take an example between an ant, an elephant, and a virus. And of course, all of you know about, I'm sure all of you know about virus now. All of you are very familiar with the word now. Okay, I'm going to compare these three. An ant, an elephant, and a virus. Okay. All of you know that elephant is a very voracious eater. Very voracious eater, right? And large herds of elephant live in forest. Have you ever heard that an elephant herd eats and destroys a forest that it lives in? Never. Even though large herds of elephant live in forest, they never destroy a forest. Right? Why is that so? Because elephants are not intensive eaters, but they're extensive eaters. They don't destroy the land they eat in. So their footprint to their footprint, ratio, if you look at it, they're extensive eaters, but not intensive eaters. They move along corridors and eat and go. And if you look at the dung also of an elephant, what's a dung? A lot of half-eaten, half-digested food. So it sort of grows back immediately to do reforestation again. Like that, the Indian economy, the Indian industrialized economy was widespread, did not destroy a forest. Let's look at the next page. Yeah. So what happened was the Indian economy, if you look at it, the industrialized economy was like elephantine in size, but the footprint was local and small. So it was like a whole bunch of ants industriously working together, but the size, cumulative size was like an elephant. So it was extensive, but not intensive. Extensive and wide, but not intensive. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Which is that particular one species, rather two species in whole of nature, creation that are very intensive? They destroy the place where they live. Do you know the two species? One is an ant. I mean, one is a virus. A virus, why are we afraid of a virus? It is intensive in an area where it comes and settles itself and eats that area very intensively and destroys the environment it lives in. That's the role of a virus. You know, one other species in whole of creation which does the same thing. It's a modern man. He comes to one place, intensively eats up that place and destroys the ecology of that place. Intensity itself. So, is any difference between a virus and a man then? That is a modern man. Who he comes to Bangalore, he destroys all the lakes, he destroys all the trees, he destroys all the gardens. So he's so intensive in nature, isn't it? So he's the way a virus eats up the ecology of where it lives in, the man also eats up the ecology where it lives in. Whereas the earlier man, 200 years back, the Indian, even though he was the industrial leader of the world, he had an eco model in mind. That's a very Indian model.
See, today we are all very used to saying, you know, we are economically viable, we are ecologically friendly. We don't say this first bit, but we all know we run our businesses only to be viable. But this phrase we normally use very frequently, ecologically friendly. But if you really look at how we had practiced industry before, we were more ecologically viable and economically friendly. There was a vast difference in our paradigm of thinking itself then. And if you again go to thinking, what do we mean by viable? You know, some of these kind of thinkings really helps when we have to think as to how we have to really practice industry and trade going forward, especially when we talk about self-sufficiency and so on, when that's becoming the key word. See, we have three words, you know, break even, profitable, and viable. And we use them all in different contexts. Can you see the
screen? Can you see the screen here?
So you say you use the word, yeah, they can.
You can see.
So you use the word break even when you are going to get back what you have invested. Now, when you say profitable, you've got more than what you have invested. That's fine. You're profitable. And then you say viable. Yeah, it makes sense to run this business when you're getting many times more than what you have invested. Otherwise, so then you start talking about a term, a notion of whether it is worth investing and getting back that return for all that you're doing. So when we talk today, we talk about economically, ecologically friendly, and we are all running our businesses with the focus only on economically viable. Whereas the earlier idea was ecologically viable and economically friendly. And the various kind of the reason why these kind of tilts have happened, there are a lot of stories, especially around dyes, around our textile, including even our the ships that we spoke about earlier, the wooden ships versus metal ships, and then railways versus inland navigation. So many choices that have happened in our history which reflect both on our industrial practices as well as our overall technology practices itself. The kind of technological choices we had made vis-a-vis the technological choices we have made subsequently in the industrial era, so-called industrial revolution era, and how things have changed. I mean, there's a major history to this whole aspect of understanding industrial practices itself. Hopefully, we'll be able to consolidate all this into one book sometimes.
No, it's already there. See, if you can look at our books, Brand Bharat, volume 1 to 5, we show all these things in a very succulent way. So those who want, you can do that. And probably what we can show you is a couple of more things. So what we've done is, see, this content in this 1 hour, what we show you something else. So this, we have made it available for those who want details of this. Okay, if you can go to our homepage, what you'll see is this is the Bharat Gyan homepage. You go there, you will get to something called courses. And if you go into this, what we spoke about, we have now, for people who want to know something in detail about this over say 5-6 sessions like this, we've got something called a Bharat Brand Ambassador course. It all comes from our Brand Bharat book, where we speak about how the industrialization of India has been a sustainable model through the ages, and how the youngsters today can once again take this idea overall, because there are many paradigm shifts happening, and with COVID there's one big paradigm shift also happening, and it's been sort of what do you call, whole change in perspectives of paradigm shifts. So this another shift happening. So with this,
if we can understand our strengths, see, fundamentally, when you look at all these the products that we were dealing with, how they were manufactured, which is why we had all that 25% world trade and 33% GDP share and all that, and how they were broken. Once you understand that, then we will get back a handle on what was our innate strength and how we are not playing to our strength, but rather are playing to others' weaknesses. So rest of the world, what their weaknesses are, and today we are still playing a game to their weaknesses rather than our strength. Their weakness need not necessarily be our strength. It is actually being a double weakness for us. So how can we go back to our strength? And when we are talking about self-sufficiency and all, then you are in a mode where you have to leverage your strengths. So once you get that idea, then that will open up our minds to look at other ways of doing things. It's a whole lateral shift in paradigm that we can.
It's happen mindset. So it has to happen among the youth. A total mindset perspective. That's what we are trying to bring out here through our books, our short films. I don't know how. Shri Prabhupada Rajanji, will you share some of our short films on steel, zinc, cotton, diamond, spices, all that with your friends, so that you can share, so they can see all the short films. Each one is just 2-3 minute short films, and most of them are. I'll just show you our short films link. Can you go back here?
If you could give a link, it would be better.
Yeah, we're showing it here. We're showing it here for you now. So if you can go into website, there's a YouTube link there in our website.
It will take you to our channel, and there you have playlists.
Sir, Mukesh. And you can see this. All this is a playlist there called Amazing India.
There is a playlist. There are about more than some 65 films.
65 films are there. 65 films are there in that, all about the industrialization perspective. Then you got something called Knowing New India. That's there. No, that's in Tamil, so you can show the other things. There's another Knowing New India, so that's also there. You can show. So there are multiple perspectives you can show this. Yeah, there's another walkthrough called Knowing New India that was shot in Varanasi as part of the Pravas Bharati Deva. So these are the perspectives that you can look at from various angles as to how India has been an industrialized land and how we can get that back over the next couple of decades. Not very far away. It's not very far away. Provided we know what our strengths are. The fundamental message is we should first know what our strengths are and play to our strengths instead of playing to meeting the weaknesses of the Europeans or Americans. Now what are we doing? What are their areas of weakness? We're trying to fill in their gaps. So we are playing actually their game to their rules in their field. That's a game that is uncomfortable to us. Okay, we've done it for a few decades now to gain some strength. Now when the shift happens, when the axis, see, first it was what? The axis was very clearly Western, between Europe and America. Then the axis shifted between America and Russia. It was a bipolar world. Then again, when the Soviet Union fell, it went back to again America. Now it's now becoming then became a unipolar world. Now it's again becoming a multipolar world. When this is happening, the shift is happening. Now we should learn to know what our strengths are. Once we get to know what our strengths are, we can play to our strengths very clearly. The moment we start playing to our strengths, we become the winner. Now we are playing to somebody else's strengths. I mean, somebody else's weaknesses. We are offering to fill in their gaps. Whereas we should play, so that it's just a game, first in the mind, first knowledge, then in the mind, only then in the play field. So that is overall the perspective that we are trying to offer you, show you here. So all available here for all of you to use any way you want. And we'll be happy to sort of hold more sessions like this, engage with this group to take it forward. And also there are a lot of courses also, so it's more intensive where detailings are there. That's also available for those who want to do. If you want to sort of, we can organize an exclusive course only for your organization.
Around just this industry aspect itself, there are so many, like the indigo industry. I mean, how it changed the whole perspective of world. Indigo was a dye, and not just indigo, many other dyes. The red dye, madder, also went from India. It is mainly from Manjishta that the red dye comes. So dyes as such went from India, but they were natural dyes. And how they flipped the world over and made us all get into a chemical mode. And from there on, how it has extended into fertilizers, pesticides, agriculture, the entire change just from this one little indigo. It's a very, very
that's a different story. That's
telling
a full
story.
1 hour story. That's actually a 1 hour story.
And that one story is enough to tell us what were our strengths, what is the weakness, what were the others' weakness, and how we are not leveraging our strengths. So what do we have to do? And that will kind of give your trade body also a kind of a perspective, which you can then work around as a kind of a philosophy. You can then shape it and take it forward.
So that is what your trade body
that
can
will be
do.
very relevant to
so
you.
You can guide, instead of just being a group of people, you can sort of guide the industry forward, that perspective. That's what you could do. Just an idea I want to share with you. Any questions, we'll be happy to, because we all.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hari, Dr. Hemari. It was great to hear from both of you. I'm sure there are a lot more questions to come up on this. And as you have suggested that we should also visit your website. We would also visit your website. Many of our members would also do it. And as you have also asked us to, share these details on the industry, we will also be doing it. But if there is any questions, any of the participants have here, you can possibly, Ramesh, can they unmute themselves?
Yes,
Kindly unmute and you can ask a question if there is anybody who wants to ask.
Any question I can, I can raise up the hand, or I'm unmuting all.
Yeah.
You can unmute and speak about that.
Satish, you had a question to ask. Can you go ahead?
I think you can read the question. I think he is posted in the chat box. There's a question asking for that. What is the suggestion to climb back?
The drop of Indian trade internationally. Drop, yes. Okay, then inspired. What is our suggestion to climb up the chart, taking us to what a revolution? Okay, yeah, like we said, the fundamental reason for the drop of Indian trade internationally was the evolution of industry in Europe. And to first, so there are actually many steps. One is, why did those industries evolve in Europe? What did they do to make those industries evolve? And once the industries evolved, what did they do to suppress industry elsewhere so that their industries can thrive and they can do the trade. So fundamentally, if our trade dropped, it was because they suppressed a whole lot of Indian industry, such as shipping, which was the main industry that we spoke about. It's a really heartrending story. If you read, it's in our book, Brand Bharat, Volume 1, Made in India. There is a more than quite about 100 pages devoted to the shipping
because
industry of India. Not just shipping trade, but shipping industry of making ships, building ships, creating people who can navigate ships, and all sciences around ships. So, and the entire thing was, squashed by Britain. And naturally, your trade is going to go down.
I'll tell you a story. When they came from London to India to trade, East India Company, Indian ships, apparently Indian ships were much bigger than the ships that came from England, right? Then, obviously. So, Indian ships went all the way up to London with their goods. You know what they did? They refused to unload goods from Indian-made ships. They brought in a law that you cannot unload goods made from Indian ships, and where the people employed are not English navigators. You know, if it's Indian ships, the people employed should be English navigators to unload goods. So they banned, allowed, whereas they could come to India in ships, Indian ships, and take goods and go back, whereas Indians could not trade. So it was very one-sided. So those days, in 1600s, you did not have trade bodies like what you have today to raise voices. So it was very one-sided. They didn't allow Indian ships, Indian traders to ply. So there's actually a full set, like an octopus, how it controls and squeezes the shipping industry. The British made very one-sided laws that allowed only British to run ships to trade between India and Europe. Because India could have parallelly traded, not that Europe only came, because Europe is going to come this way to trade. India can go this way to trade, isn't it? Which they did, but didn't allow it to happen because they said, if Indians are there in the ships, it not allowed. So it was like an octopus. Actually, show you that image. We have that image, octopus image. Can you show the navigation? Okay, then we'll have to share screens. All there in our website and our book, you can see. So like an octopus, they squeezed it. And every trade was balanced like that.
So India's trade did not fall for the fault of Indians. It fell because of oppression by others. And the change of model of industrialization by the world, which today anyway, the whole world is repenting in a way. I mean, everybody is crying that, pollution and this and that. But so it is, these are the two fundamental reasons that
see, we had an extensive model, whereas they had an intensive model. We had a decentralized model. Again, that we have dealt with in our book, Decentralization. How we were an extensive decentralized model, whereas they were a very intensive centralized model. That is why if you look at it, the person who is in charge of a district is not a district administrator, he's a collector. Because what is his role? To collect money, to collect revenue. So he's a collector. He's not a district administrator. Like that, every perspective was focused on extracting from this land of India. That's why Montgomery again very clearly says that I see two things. The land is rich, but the people are poor because you extracted too much from this land. That's a perspective. Okay. Any other question, please?
No more questions, sir. I think it was a wonderful and inspiring today's speech. In fact, we study the history only on administration part. I think this industrialization revolution, I think we don't study. I think a really inspiring story. I think what we understand, especially our India has so much wonderful, inspiring story. So now I would like to invite Rupa Rani to give her closing remarks, and in fact, the time is already up. So, key vote of thanks also.
Yeah, thank you, Ramesh Shivanna. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, it was a wonderful, wonderful session today evening. Even though it was Sunday, we thought when it comes to Mughal, Vasco da Gama and all, we think it's taking back to our school days. When we were school children, we used to hear a lot about Vasco da Gama, Mughal and all these things. And he was a great navigator. there is a museum in Cochin. Whenever I used to go, I used to think of our social studies. Okay, and today you brought back the memory of social studies and the teachers as well. And I'm really great thankful to the couple, Mr. and Mrs. Harry, and the era. It is a great research you couple have done. The era, it is 1850 to 1950 industrialization, 1940 to 1980 transportation, 1980 to 2000 computer era, 2000 to 2020 communication, 2020 onwards knowledge era. Yeah, it was a very grateful knowledge session. Those days, even though they didn't had computer, WhatsApp, social media and all, they did tremendous great work. So now we should be doing better. Even this COVID period also, I think we will come out of it if we think of all the civilization, revolution and all these things. So today evening we had a very great thing, and I would like to say thanks to my colleagues. Prabhudev Aradhya sir was behind this session. Like since he gave the idea, why not we do this? So he was the main person to have today this session. And then our Ramesh Shivanna, always he is the host for us and very helping hand for us. Anytime we call, he is ready to do the Zoom sessions always. And my colleague, Mr. Satish, to coordinate the event. And my special thanks to the amazing couple, our Mr. and Mrs. Harry. It was a very, very wonderful session. And thanks a lot. I think I look forward to have one more session for 2 hours, because you have taught us the branding, the brand Damas. I used to wonder what is this Damas. So you have taught us the meaning of Damas and history about the wool. That is Historia, a person who is named our cotton as a sheep wool. So this and all is a great knowledge sharing session. So we would like to know more and more about all these things. So for today, I think we had a wonderful session. Thank you one and all, and the participants who took their time on Sunday. For them also my special thanks, and thank you one and all. Thank you.
Thank you.